The morning sun slanted across the cul-de-sac, glinting off the immaculate windshields of identical SUV. Every lawn was trimmed with military precision, every mailbox polished to a sterile gleam. The neighborhood looked like a magazine spread perfect, controlled, and utterly lifeless. Margaret Hale drove slowly, her old Subaru coughing in protest as she turned the corner. She felt every eye on her as she passed, the jogger who stopped mid-stride, the man watering his begonias, the curtain twitching from the house at the corner. This was that kind of neighborhood. She parked in front of Lot 14, the only property that looked out of place, paint peeling, porch sagging, shutters clinging on for dear life. She smiled, perfect, she murmured to herself. After 30 years of courtrooms and endless paperwork, Margaret had decided to retire somewhere quiet. The house was a fixer-upper, but she'd bought it legally at auction. She'd already filed all the proper documents, and the county clerk had confirmed the transfer of title. The deed was hers, fair and square. She got out, balancing her coffee and a thick folder of documents, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like cut grass and faint hostility. She'd barely taken 3 steps toward the porch when she heard the clicking of shoes on pavement. "Excuse me," the voice came sharp, authoritative. Margaret turned to see 3 people striding toward her, middle-aged, polo shirts tucked too tightly, clipboards in hand. The kind of people who didn't ask questions so much as issue demands. The man in front, tall with a shiny bald spot and an air of misplaced importance, led the charge. His lanyard bounced with every step. Thomas Beckett, HOA president. Behind him marched a thin woman with a helmet of blonde hair, her lips pursed into permanent disapproval, and a shorter man in sunglasses who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "This is private property," Thomas declared, stopping short of her driveway. "You can't park here." Margaret blinked, a polite smile forming. "Actually, I can. I own this property now." He let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "You must be mistaken. This property belongs to the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. You can't just walk in here." "I didn't just walk in," Margaret said, calm as still water. "I purchased this home at the county foreclosure auction last week. Here," she lifted the folder slightly, "are the documents to prove it." The woman with the blonde hair scoffed. "We would have known if this house sold. We have first rights of refusal on all foreclosures." "That's true," Margaret said evenly, "but the HOA failed to file that right before the auction. I checked." The 3 exchanged looks, disbelief flickering between them. Thomas crossed his arms. "That's impossible. We've never missed a filing." "Apparently you did," she said and sipped her coffee. The shorter man muttered, "Tom, maybe we should." But Thomas cut him off. No, this is trespassing." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." Margaret exhaled slowly. "You're welcome to, but I assure you that won't go the way you think." He ignored her, barking into the phone about a trespasser refusing to leave community property. The blonde woman filmed Margaret discreetly, her phone angled just below her chin. Within 10 minutes, the sound of sirens drifted down the street. 2 patrol cars rolled up, lights flashing lazily, as though embarrassed to be there. A few neighbors gathered on porches, arms folded, eager for the show. One of the officers, a young man who looked barely old enough to rent a car, stepped forward. "Morning, folks, what's going on here?" Thomas took a step toward him, brimming with authority he didn't have. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This woman broke into this property and refuses to leave. She claims she owns it." The officer turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, do you have ID or proof of ownership?" Margaret opened her folder and handed over a neatly clipped set of papers. Title, deed, and confirmation from the county clerk's office. All legal. The officer flipped through the documents, eyebrows climbing higher with every page. "Ma'am, this looks legit. The deed's in your name. Judge Margaret Hale." Thomas's face twitched. "Judge, She gave a small, tight smile. Retired, as of 3 months ago. The blonde woman stepped forward, face flushing red. You can't buy property here without HOA approval. We have rules. Margaret nodded. I read your bylaws. They're ambitious, but they don't supersede state property law. The officer cleared his throat. Mr. Beckett, unless you've got evidence this isn't her property, there's nothing criminal here. Thomas's voice rose, desperate. She forged it. She must have. There's no way. Tom, the shorter man murmured, tugging at his sleeve. Maybe we should check with the lawyer first. Margaret's patience was beginning to thin, though her voice stayed cool. Mr. Beckett, you've accused me of trespassing, attempted to involve law enforcement under false pretenses, and now you're implying forgery. You're walking a fine line. Thomas swallowed hard. We just have procedures, and I respect that, she interrupted softly, but your procedures don't override state law or judicial orders. Something shifted in her tone, then something that made both officers glance at her with recognition. The young officer cleared his throat again, straightening slightly. Judge Hale, is there anything else you'd like us to note in our report? Thomas blinked, looking between them. Report? What report? Margaret met the officer's eyes. Just that I was approached and harassed by members of this HOA while accessing property I legally own. That should be enough. Understood, ma'am, the officer said, nodding respectfully. Thomas's clipboard slipped from his fingers, hitting the driveway with a dull thud. The blonde woman's face drained of color. The shorter man muttered something about needing to check a file and backed away. Margaret gathered her papers calmly, tucking them under her arm. I suggest you verify your own filings before making any more accusations. It would be unfortunate if this little misunderstanding became a formal matter. The officer handed her back the documents, his tone professional but deferential. Have a good day, Judge Hale. She smiled faintly. You too, officer. As she walked toward the porch, she could feel the weight of their stares on her back. The sudden, dawning realization that the woman they'd tried to intimidate was someone who could do far more than quote bylaws. She paused at the door and turned slightly, her voice mild. Oh, and Mr. Beckett, he looked up, face pale and tight. You might want to let your lawyer know the auction was handled through the county court system, she said. If you've got complaints, they'll end up on a docket. Thomas opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Margaret gave him a polite nod and stepped inside her new home, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. Outside, the 3 HOA members stood frozen on the sidewalk, the illusion of power slipping like sand through their fingers. The neighbors began to disperse, whispering as they went. By the time the patrol cars drove off, only Thomas remained, staring at the peeling paint of the house that was now undeniably, irrevocably not his to control. And behind that door, Margaret allowed herself a slow smile. She'd come here for peace and quiet, but if the HOA wanted to play games, well, she'd spent a lifetime playing on a much bigger field. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and anxiety. The echo of footsteps bounced off marble floors as people took their seats, murmuring in low, uncertain voices. The Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association board members sat clustered at the defense table, 3 of them, all in formal clothes that looked more like armor than attire. Thomas Beckett sat in the middle, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale. The blonde woman, Cynthia Reed, dabbed her forehead with a tissue, whispering to their attorney. The third, a smaller man named David Ortiz, stared at the table, eyes fixed on a single spot, as though hoping to disappear into it. They had imagined this hearing would be informal, some minor dispute about paperwork. But when they walked into courtroom 3B and saw her sitting behind the bench, wearing a black robe and an expression like carved granite, they realized how wrong they were. Judge Margaret Hale didn't look like the woman they'd met on that driveway. That day she had been polite, patient, even gentle. Today she looked like the law itself, still, cold, immovable. The bailiff's voice cut through the air. All rise, the Court of the Eighth Circuit is now in session, the Honorable Judge Margaret Hale presiding. Everyone stood. The sound of chairs scraping filled the silence. Margaret nodded slightly to the room. Please be seated. Papers rustled as she glanced over the case file before her. The gold seal gleamed at the top. State of New Hampshire vs. Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association, et al. She looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes briefly. He flinched. This court is here to address the matter of harassment, unlawful interference with property rights, and the misuse of law enforcement by the Pinewood Estates HOA and its board members. Her voice was calm, but every syllable landed like a hammer. Their attorney, a nervous-looking man named Kenneth, rose to speak. Your Honor, my clients meant no harm. This was a misunderstanding regarding property ownership. They acted under the belief that you were trespassing. Margaret raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding that resulted in the police being called to remove a lawful homeowner from her property. Kenneth shifted his weight. They believed they were following HOA procedure. She nodded slowly, flipping through her notes. I'm quite familiar with HOA procedures, Mr. Peterson. What I'm less familiar with is how those procedures authorize slander, harassment, or the falsification of reports to local law enforcement. Kenneth opened his mouth, but before he could respond, Margaret continued. Let's begin with Exhibit A. The bailiff handed her a folder. She opened it, revealing several printed pages, emails, screenshots, and police statements. These, she said, her tone sharp, are records of communication between the HOA board and the local police department. In them, your clients assert that I, at that time, a private citizen, was trespassing and refusing to vacate community property. She looked up again, her gaze sweeping across the defendants. Do any of you deny writing or authorizing these communications? Thomas swallowed hard. We all approve the message, yes, but only because we believed that the HOA owned the property. She interrupted. Despite never having filed the necessary legal claim to enforce first purchase rights, Cynthia leaned forward, her voice trembling. We didn't know the filing hadn't gone through. We thought. Margaret held up a hand, silencing her. You thought, you acted on assumption, and when confronted with legal documents proving ownership, you still called the police, accused me of forgery, and attempted to have me arrested. The words hung in the air. Even Kenneth didn't try to speak this time. Margaret's voice softened, but it carried more weight for it. This isn't about me. It's about how often people like you, people in small positions of authority, abuse power because you think no one will challenge you. You believe that fear and rules are the same as law. Thomas's shoulders slumped. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. Margaret turned a page. Exhibit B, she said. Testimony from 3 homeowners in Pinewood Estates who filed separate complaints about harassment by the same HOA board. Repeated fines for trivial matters. Threats of liens over decorative lights. Intimidation. She set the papers down. You've created a culture of fear in your own neighborhood. Kenneth finally spoke again, his voice small. Your Honor, while I understand your frustration, surely suspension of the HOA authority is an extreme. She fixed him with a look that froze him mid-sentence. Extreme is threatening to evict a woman for planting tomatoes in her backyard. Extreme is calling the police on a rightful property owner because her car didn't match your standards. What's extreme? Here, Mr. Peterson, is the arrogance with which this board operated. A faint murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom gallery. Residents from Pinewood Estates, there to witness the reckoning. Margaret tapped her pen once against the bench. The court has reviewed the full record. Based on the evidence presented, it's clear that the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association acted beyond the limits of its authority and in direct violation of both state housing and harassment laws. Thomas's head dropped. Cynthia covered her face with her hands. I, therefore, order, Margaret continued, her voice steady, that the current HOA board's authority be suspended pending independent audit. A receiver will be appointed to manage association affairs during this process. She paused to let the words settle, then went on, additionally, this court imposes fines totaling $15,000 to be paid by the board members collectively for unlawful harassment and misuse of public resources. Further, restitution will be provided to affected homeowners within 90 days. The gavel struck once. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Thomas started to speak, voice shaking. Your Honor, we didn't know. If we'd known you were... Margaret cut him off sharply. That's the problem, Mr. Beckett. You only care because I'm a judge. You didn't care when it was your neighbors. You didn't care when it was a widow fined for a wheelchair ramp, or when a veteran's fence was an inch too tall. You only care when power stops working in your favor. Her tone softened just a fraction. You forgot the law applies both ways. For a long moment no one moved. The quiet was so deep it was almost reverent. Then slowly Margaret gathered her papers, removing her reading glasses. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck again. The bailiff called for order as the courtroom buzzed to life. Reporters whispered into recorders, residents murmured in disbelief, and the HOA members sat in stunned silence. Thomas turned to Kenneth, voice barely audible. Can we appeal this? Kenneth shook his head slowly. You can try, he said, but I wouldn't recommend picking that fight. Margaret stepped down from the bench, the rustle of her robe trailing behind her like a quiet storm. As she passed, a few residents nodded respectfully, some even clapped softly. She acknowledged them with a faint smile, then kept walking. Outside the courthouse the sun was bright and clear, and the chill of early spring hung in the air. She paused at the top of the steps, looking out at the city. Justice, she thought, didn't always happen in grand gestures or headline cases. Sometimes it happened in the quiet correction of arrogance, in the humbling of those who thought they could rule unchecked. Margaret descended the steps slowly, her heels echoing against the stone. Behind her, the door closed on the HOA board, now stripped of their authority and left to face the community they had tried so hard to control. At the bottom of the steps, she stopped beside her car, breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in months, she felt the deep, steady satisfaction of something set right. Pinewood Estates would change after this. The people who lived there would talk about the day the HOA tried to take on a stranger and lost, because that stranger turned out to be the law itself. Margaret smiled faintly to herself, got into her car, and drove away.